Yeah. So we'll just get straight into the questions from contributors. The first one is from an Angus Sinclair, and he asks, is Dave King and the board going to back the manager in the up and coming transfer markets? Stephen has been backed in the past, but surely all heard Stephen's comments lately, where he has clearly and openly said there is only so much he and his team can do without spending money, which clearly references that he hasn't spent any money over the past 2 windows. And as I said, that's from Angus Sinclair.
I wasn't aware of Stephen's comment in that regard, and I'm a little surprised by it. I mean, I think obviously the context of the comment would perhaps make a difference, but if I can put it this way, that I think Stephen is already on record, certainly in discussions I've had with him and comments I've seen him make in the media subsequently, in having pretty much unstinting praise, I think, for the support he has had from the board. And I think that question might be related more to Europe. And I think it's really positioning the club and saying that without heavy expenses, say in the transfer window, it's going to be very difficult to make progress in Europe. And particularly, I think if there was ambitions this year for the Champions League. But if you look at what we, I think, know to be true, I think Stephen has placed on record his support to the board for supporting him in the transfer window. But I think also it's important for supporters who might not realise this, that the manner in which the board has supported Stephen was essentially to try and bridge the gap that the club's got, because we're a big club with big ambitions, but in a small footballing market, which is Scotland. And we also come through the period of regime change where we had to be very, very careful in managing the financial resources of the club. And one of the things that we decided was the best way forward, not only for the kind of urgent circumstances we found at the time, but we think it was a fairly permanent reason going forward for Rangers Football Club, is that we had to be very clever with our transfer activity. And the area that we targeted is that if you've got a player coming into the club from another league, it could be a lower English Premier League club, it could be a Championship club, without exception, these players are going to be earning more wages than would be available even for top clubs in Scotland. And you were never going to get a player unless you paid his level of wages. So what we decided to do as a transfer strategy was try and predetermine the players we wanted in and try and bring them in a basis where we met their wage requirements, but we tried to avoid the transfer fees. And that's really quite simple, because the transfer fees goes to the club. The fact that you pay a high transfer fee, £5 or £10 million for a player, doesn't make his wages come down. He doesn't come to the club and say, I'll pay for less because you paid a transfer fee. So what we tried to do is we tried to bulk up the wages to attract the right players, but to avoid paying transfer fees. And I think that's continued since I left the board. I think between Ross and Stephen, they've done a really good job about pre-identifying players. They brought some players in early. And I think it'd be a very obvious calculation for any supporter to make, to look at the quality of players who've come into the club with Simpson, Ryden, Lundstrom and Sakala, and look at the players who left the club. And there is no doubt that the wage bill has again gone up this season. So as far as I'm concerned, the board has certainly supported the manager in the transfer window. And I think that is his true belief. I mean, my understanding is he does recognise he has been supported, but he's making more a comment that if we're going to make progress saying things at the Champions League, we need to start finding other ways to attract players.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Dave, for that perspective. Okay, so the second question comes from Gerald Lunn, and he writes, Dave, no disrespect to you or to the Club 1872 legacy scheme, but do you feel that Club 1872 will ever have enough members to purchase your shares? Are you prepared to wait and hold on to the unpurchased shares?
The second part of the question is quite easy. I'm prepared to wait. I don't regard the relationship or agreement that I have with Club 1872 as being a commitment from Club 1872. It's really an opportunity for Club 1872 to acquire as many shares as they possibly can. And if Club 1872 get halfway there, 60% there, then, from my point of view, that is fine. But I'm certainly hoping that the logic of supporters and supporters groups having an influential shareholder in the club going forward resonates with supporters. And I'm really hoping the campaign of Club 1872 does result in Club 1872 acquiring all the shareholders, because I really genuinely, totally, absolutely believe that meaningful supporter representation at the shareholder level, I think is critical for any football club going forward, not just for Rangers. So I'm optimistic that Club 1872 will achieve it. But if they don't, then that's fine. I'll continue to hold the shares, and it'll just be another supporter, hopefully working in tandem with Club 1872 going forward. But ideally, I would like Club 1872 to acquire them all.
Yes, I think your answer leads quite well into a question from Bruce Taylor. Bruce asks, how does Dave King envisage supporters playing a part in the future of the administration of their clubs that is meaningful and goes beyond turn up, support and pay?
Yeah, and that comes back to the representation. If you look at the history of supporters, and I'm closer to it in the context of Rangers because I've been around the board for over 20 years. And in my view, supporters at Rangers and other football clubs don't get a fair shake. And the reason they don't get that is because the economic impact of supporters, so certainly take Scottish football, the biggest contributor to the funding of Rangers is supporters. Now, during regime change, myself and other fellow directors and shareholders, we agreed to lead the investment into the club. But still, as much as say in my case, I was the lead investor during that period, supporters collectively put more money into the club than I did or my fellow directors did. Mm-hmm. Yet supporters have very little to no say in the running of the club. And it kind of goes back to the unfortunate situation that led to regime change. Supporters found themselves completely without a voice. And the only way they could ultimately get a meaningful voice in the club was to boycott the football team. Now, that happened once in 150 years history of that club. We don't want it to happen again. We don't want the supporters to have to exercise their influence in the club by voting with their feet and not buying product and not buying season tickets. And the only way to avoid that in the long term is to make sure that when from time to time, as will happen again in the future, in the history of Rangers, it will happen again when supporters' voices will need to be heard. And the best way for that to happen consistently, without the kind of violent impact that things like boycotts have, is to have an influential shareholding and representation on the board. So their voice is being heard all the time, not only in moments of crisis.
Yeah. One of the reasons that people have given throughout the 4 years of Club 1872's history for cancelling their memberships is that there's a feeling that the job was done in 2015. I remember Craig Houston, who was actively involved in the Sons of Struth protests prior to regime change and sat on the Club 1872 board. And I remember him saying that his partner, after regime change, said to him, I can cancel my my Rangers First subscription. And he said, why? And she said, because the job's done, the club's secured. And he said, well, that's not really how it works. And I think that was an important message then, and it's still an important message now. And Craig Robertson, a contributor, has asked, do you still believe that Club 1872 is necessary when there is a board of Rangers people? Is it still relevant?
I actually think it's critical. I think it's actually more than necessary. I really feel it's essential. And I think it would be very, very naive of any supporter to think that Rangers will not go through situations in the future where it requires levels of influence and representation from supporters. It's absolutely going to happen. And if one is looking at a comfort level, I certainly don't have a comfort level. I think it's great that we've achieved what we've achieved in the recovery phase, but there are still challenges ahead. And if I can give you a very, very direct example in my own experience, when I first came onto the board in the David Murray era, we were winning all the trophies, winning the tournaments, very strong team, did well in Europe. And I think every single supporter at that point in time would probably have said the club's in safe hands. David Murray is a supporter, and people like myself, we were all supporters on the board. Mm-hmm. But look what happened.
Yeah.
That was a false comfort, because when that was no longer true, supporters did not have enough influence to affect the outcome of what happened thereafter. Yeah. And we saw changes to the structure. We saw changes that the supporters were violently opposed to. We saw changes that resulted in complete disconnect and disrespect to the supporter, and the supporters just had to sit by and suffer that. So where was the comfort level from 6-7 years earlier during the David Murray reign, where everyone thought that's fine, the club is fantastic? The club will go through challenges in the future. There is no doubt in my mind about that. It happens to all clubs. It's happened to clubs south of the border at the moment. And the only way that the supporters can consistently influence that over time is to be a significant shareholder sitting at the table when all decisions are made. And I repeat, not just when a crisis emerges. And that's what happens with supporters. Because they don't have shareholder representation, they only find out what's really happening when a crisis emerges. Yeah. And very often it's too late and it's out of their control.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I'm just looking at the other questions that have come in. If contributors don't buy your shares, from what you know of how the club issues shares to raise capital, do you think it's possible that Club 1872 could ever acquire 25% interest in Rangers based solely on acquiring shares issued by the club? And that is from Janice Ferguson.
I don't think that will be possible. As I understand it, the board policy hasn't changed, that the issuance of shares will be something that's declining going forward, and it will be a self-sustaining business model going forward. So I really don't see large share issues in the future. And then secondly, if there are large share issues, I don't see Club 1872 being offered more than their current proportion of shareholding. And thirdly, as we all know, it's already been intimated that future shareholding issues will be done at levels that will be a lot higher than the deal that I've offered supporters. So from a supporters point of view, they're going to acquire more influence for less money by acquiring the shares for me, because that's been done at my historical cost, than I think participating in future share issues. So first of all, I don't think they'll be available to supporters anywhere near that level. And secondly, I think it'd be a far more expensive option. And I think if one looks at the recent I would call it the phantom share issue that Rangers put out in place. It raised money from supporters on the basis of issuing shares. The supporters have no influence over these shares. I don't think a single supporter actually has a share certificate. So again, money has gone into the club in a manner that has not assisted supporters with increasing their influence going forward. I believe it is vital that supporters start to really exert a level of influence on a consistent basis that gives them a voice at the club.
Yeah, and I think you've spoken before about it being a collective voice, because you talked about, prior to regime change, trying to corral individual shareholders and the difficulties that you experienced at that point. So I think that's one of the benefits of Club 1872, is that it offers a collective voice.
Absolutely. I mean, to me, if I look at the regime change process and I look at what happened after that club in terms of rebuilding the club, because we look back now and we're all grateful for where we are, and 55 was fantastic, but it wasn't an even path. It wasn't a smooth path with a gentle curve coming back to success. There were still ups and downs. They had to be managed, and that would have been far more difficult if the club and perhaps myself in particular did not have a strong relationship with the Club 1872. And that relationship was based on having a collective voice that you could talk to, speaking to representatives who were duly elected to represent that voice, and having an open and honest relationship where, you yourself know, Club 1872 would come to me with sensitive things. Some things I could deal with, some things I couldn't deal with. Yeah. But there was always open and frank dialogue on the issues. And at least I always felt that I knew where supporters were coming from. And I think supporters always knew where I was coming from, even if I couldn't immediately deal with some of the issues that were raised. But it was open, it was transparent, and it was very, very effective. Whereas if I go back to the attempts at regime change and dealing with individual supporters, it was not only impossible to almost corral that into a single voting unit, but a lot of people who actually wanted to vote couldn't find share certificates, didn't have any documentation. So it became a very, very difficult process just to collect everyone into a single voting pool and then to effectively administer that in a manner that would allow us to influence the club. And, regime change, it was very close at one stage. When we were chasing every 100 votes, every 200 votes, it was very, very tight. And if 1872 had been in place, that process at that time would have been a lot easier for me.
Yeah. So you've spoken a wee bit there about the relationship with Club 1872. We have had a question on whether you whether you retain confidence in the board of Club 1872. And a similar question came in from, let me just check. From Jim Wood, and he says, recently the directors of Club 1872 have been severely criticised by a previous director and on follow. Why do you have confidence in the board to acquire your shares and to manage them?
Yeah, I think there's two parts to my answer. I think the mere fact that I'm having this conversation with you and the fact that I'm continuing to promote the transfer of my shares to Club 1872 is a clear indication that I still have support both for the institution and for the people leading it. I think also very importantly that in my experience for over 20 years with Rangers, you do get situations where you get individual supporters, and this happened 20 years ago with a supporters group. like to exercise influence for their own personal reasons. Now, in my dealings with Club 1872, I have never for a moment felt that the people I was dealing with as directors right throughout the period from my first engagement with 1872 to this present day were ever doing anything other than giving selfless time and effort in the interests of the club. And I've never had an instance where I ever felt a director of Club 1872 was putting the club or was putting their interests ahead of the club. Never, ever, ever. And that is why when these allegations first surfaced, I was careful enough, and I think it's well known that I was given access to the information. And it wasn't surprising for me to find out that the claims being made against the directors were absolutely false. And I think this is one of the dangers of the success of Club 1872 that I think all members must be alert to at all times, is because Club 1872 has been successful, because this campaign will lead at whatever level it gets to a greater interest in Rangers Football Club and a greater say in the affairs of the club. There will be individuals from time to time will come and try and hijack for their own purposes. And they will use social media. So I think that the supporters of Club 1872 have got to be incredibly vigilant in continuing to be very, very careful about accusations like made against the office holders. Yes, the office holders must be accountable, but they must be accountable to the facts, not to smear campaigns, not to media campaigns. And in my dealings with Club 1872, I've gone and I still go on the basis of my direct reaction to the people who have been running and are presently running Club 1872. And my experience has been nothing but good. So every one of you continues to enjoy my full support.
Okay, thank you for that, Dave. Jim Smith has asked, does Mr. King still have full confidence in the aims and aspirations of the present RIFC board?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the board is still a continuation. I just think if you look at, again, what happened in the transfer window, I don't have any peculiar insight to the numbers because I'm not on the board anymore, but it's very obvious to me that further investment has been made in the club. The club had a transfer window where players came in, wages went up, and players didn't go out. We know that. So I think we all understand the wage bill has gone up. The Champions League wasn't achieved this year, but this becomes a very big season because it's automatic into next year. So I think the club has continued to invest in that. And I think also fortunately that you've got Douglas and John Bennett who kind of took over the role I had, because what supporters might not know is that in prior years, not only did I have to invest in the club, but I also had to give, say, cashback guarantees each year because we're trading at a loss. So it wasn't just the money you put in the club, you also had to provide cash guarantees to get UEFA licenses, SFA licenses to act as a going concern. And the fact that Douglas and John have stepped in, I think they said their last annual report, and that they're now providing that, and they've got all the knowledge of what's going on, just gives me a strong indication that the board is continuing to put the club first and make the necessary investments and back it with their own money. And I think supporters can't ask for more than that.
Yeah. Okay, just a couple more questions, Dave. We have a question from Chris Miller. If a commercial organisation wanted to invest substantial money in Rangers like Newcastle and wanted to rename the stadium, would you be prepared to cooperate with 1872 and other Rangers shareholders to create a voting bloc to prevent that from happening?
I certainly would work with Club 1872 and all supporters to block any deal of any kind that I felt and my fellow supporters felt was not being fair to the club or was not in the interests or traditions of the club. So yes, I mean, if a deal came, I'm not suggesting that any big deal would be detrimental to the club. It may realise our ambitions in Europe, for example. So one would have to look at the deal very carefully. But whatever deal came, if that deal went against the traditions of Rangers Football Club in a way that we felt were harmful, in other words, traditions can't be an anchor to the club. Traditions can't hold the club back. Traditions can move and mold with the times. So I would look at that deal very, very carefully. And if I and fellow supporters felt it was not in the interest of the club, then absolutely certainly I would join with them in voting against it. Anything that's unhealthy for the club or the supporters, I would vote against.
That's good to know, Dave. Okay, just one final question, and it comes from Gordon Mackay. If Club 1872 acquired your shares, would you become the director sitting on the board on the fans' behalf? And that obviously refers to Club 1872's stated aim of having a place on the RIFC board. I
would be surprised if that would happen. I mean, I wouldn't think so for the simple for the simple reason that I think the members of Club 1872 would vote on who they felt was the right person to sit on the Rangers board. And I would be surprised if they would vote for me. I would think there's a lot of other really good candidates who live in Glasgow, who are closer to the club, who are working very, very hard to promote the interests and ambitions of Club 1872. And I would imagine with a vote of Club 1872 members, I'd be very, very surprised if I was their first choice. Okay.
Well, as you know, Dave, we plan to relaunch the Legacy campaign over the next few weeks, and I know that you've offered to do further interactions and engagements with Club 1872 and the contributors, so we look forward to that. Just actually, there was one more question that came in, and it referred to, it's from an Alan Calder, and he says there's a large Scottish contingent in South Africa. Does Dave have connections in Johannesburg or Cape Town who might contribute to Club 1872?
You know, interestingly, it was Alan Calder. I think he might not be aware, but I think the Scottish contingent in South Africa is actually reduced quite dramatically. When I first came here in 1976 and I was playing football, there were many options for me to play in what would be called Scottish clubs. There was a Benoni Caledonians and a Jemison Cali. So there was a lot of Scottish clubs. There were Caledonian societies, which were all the Scottish guys, and it was very, very prevalent then. But I think over the last couple of decades, with changes to the South African economy and changes to the risk profile of just living in South Africa, I think a huge amount of people have gone back to Scotland, moved on to Australia and other countries. So the contingent is not as strong as it was, but I do come across Scots people from time to time. And I think some of them are members of Club 1872, quite frankly. So I guess they would go through that avenue, but I certainly don't have anyone that comes to mind that I would be able to approach for a significant investment, other than kind of rallying people for 1872. And I think really that if Club 1872, you know, has a campaign where, I don't know how many members you've got at the moment, but it just requires, you know, for a short period of time, each member to bring in a member.
Yes.
Do that 2 or 3 times. And Club 1872 can very, very quickly get up to speed and exercise that level of interest over the club. I really don't see why this has to be a long drawn out campaign. If the supporters really want to seriously influence the club as a legacy going forward and apply the type of energy and support that they've always given to the club in the past under crisis. Yes. So view it almost as let's avert impending crises going forward by acting now. And by acting now, we can actually avoid these situations forever. We'll actually have an influence. We'll always have, you know, a seat at the table. And I think this is the time to do it. And if Club 1872, if each member just gets one and that one gets one,
yes,
I think in a very, very short period of time, you'll find yourself very, very quickly up to speed.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, a good message to get across to contributors. Okay, Dave, listen, thank you for your time again. Some interesting perspectives there. And as I said, we look forward to further engagement with you as the Legacy campaign progresses.
Thank you very much, Laura. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Dave. Take care.
Power.